Here is another story from a listener, this time from the secluded woods of upstate New York. Before we dive in, please like and subscribe to this video. Your support is what keeps this channel going. If you've heard anything similar or know more about the strange occurrences in this area, leave it in the comments below. Now, get ready for a chilling tale of survival and terror. The dense forests of upstate New York hold secrets that have been whispered about for generations. Stories of people who vanished without a trace, of strange shadows moving through the trees, and of creatures that seem to blur the line between human and beast. This is one of those stories, passed down from a grandfather who knew the woods like the back of his hand. What follows is a tale of survival, terror, and a glimpse into something no one wants to believe is real. Step into the abyss, and welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and join our ever-growing community of the curious. Your support is the lifeblood that keeps this channel alive. Now, prepare yourself, for what you're about to witness is not for the faint of heart. When I was growing up, my grandfather used to tell me stories about his time building railroads through the countryside of upstate New York. He was a hard man, used to long days of physical labor and cold nights under the stars. But when he spoke about the woods, there was a different look in his eyes, a mix of fear and awe that I didn't understand as a kid. He told me about people who had gone missing while working on the railroads, strong, capable men who simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but their tools and the occasional bloodied piece of clothing. "The woods have eyes," he'd say, "and sometimes they don't like what they see." One story stood out to me. It was about a group of workers who went missing near a remote section of the forest. When a search party went looking for them, they found a gruesome scene: tools scattered everywhere, blood splattered on the trees, and what looked like bite marks on T-bark. My grandfather swore that whatever took those men wasn't a bear or a wolf. It was something else, he said, something that shouldn't exist. As I got older, I dismissed his stories as just that, stories. But then, a few years ago, I had my own encounter, and everything changed. It was early fall, and I had decided to spend a weekend hiking through the secluded Allegheny State Park in western New York. The weather was still warm during the day, with just a hint of the cooler nights to come. I've always loved the solitude of the woods, the way the towering trees seem to swallow all sound and time. I wasn't expecting anything more than a peaceful escape from the chaos of everyday life. The first day was uneventful. I hiked deep into the forest, enjoying the crisp air and the sight of snow-covered trees. I set up camp near a frozen creek and spent the evening reading by the fire. But as the night fell, I started to feel uneasy. The woods were too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around midnight, I heard it. A low, guttural growl that froze me in place. Grabbing my flashlight and my gun, I stepped out of my tent and scanned the darkness. At first, there was nothing, just the eerie silence of the forest. But then, I saw it. Crouched low near a thicket of bushes. At first glance, it looked almost human, like a dirty lost person with patchy hair and torn clothing. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Its mouth was unnaturally large, and when it turned slightly, I caught a glimpse of its teeth. They were sharp, jagged, and far too large for a human. The creature just stared at me, its eyes wild and unblinking. I shouted, threatening to shoot, but it didn't flinch or even seem to understand my words. Slowly, I raised my gun and fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed through the trees, but the thing didn't run. It just stood up, hunched and towering, before turning and walking away into the darkness. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, as if it was trying to imitate a human but failing. I was in the middle of nowhere, and that sight chilled me to my core. I didn't sleep a minute that night, too afraid it might return. The following day, I packed up camp and started hiking back the way I came. But the woods felt different. Every direction seemed unfamiliar, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. As night fell again, I set up a smaller makeshift camp near a dense cluster of trees. The silence was oppressive, broken only by occasional rustling in the underbrush. Each sound made my heart race, convinced it was coming back. At one point, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a flash of that same hunched figure. I called out, demanding it show itself, but nothing happened. The woods swallowed my voice, leaving me alone with my fear. I kept my gun within arm's reach, my eyes darting to every shadow. Whatever that thing was, it felt like it was watching, waiting. The hours dragged on, and I stayed awake until dawn, jumping at every snap of a twig. On the third night, I stumbled upon an old railroad clearing marked by rusting equipment and a few crumbling wooden shacks. One of the shacks looked like it had been lived in recently. Inside, I found tattered blankets, old cans of food, and strange symbols carved into the walls. The air was thick with a rancid smell, like decay and wet fur. I didn't stay long. Something about that place felt wrong, as if I was trespassing on someone or something's territory. I pushed on, driven by sheer desperation. My knife was dull from cutting through underbrush, and my sidearm was down to its last few rounds. I started to wonder if I'd ever make it out, or if I'd become another one of the forest's forgotten victims. Finally, as the sun rose on the fifth day, I found a trail. It was faint and overgrown, but it led me to a road where I flagged down a passing truck. The driver didn't believe my story, but he could see the fear in my eyes and the state I was in. He drove me to the nearest town, and I swore to myself I'd never go back to those woods. Since then, I've spent countless hours researching. The stories my grandfather told me weren't unique. There are countless accounts of strange creatures in upstate New York, part human, part wolf, and completely horrifying. Some say they're the spirits of cursed people. Others believe they're a result of some horrific experiment. Whatever the truth is, I know one thing for sure. They're out there. So, what do you think? Are these creatures real, or just the product of overactive imaginations? If you've heard similar stories or have any information, let me know in the comments. Maybe together we can uncover the truth. The forests of upstate New York, blanketed in snow, hushed by winter, and steeped in tales of old. But beneath the serenity lies a darker truth. For centuries, whispers of beasts in the woods have been passed from one generation to the next, dismissed as folklore by some and feared as gospel by others. One fateful winter, a group of friends set out for a weekend in the wilds, eager for adventure. But what they found was something far beyond their imagination. What follows is one of those stories that clings to the shadows, too horrific to share yet too haunting to forget. This is their story. I never imagined I'd be the one telling a story like this. Stories like these are the kind you hear from old-timers sitting around campfires, their faces lit by flickering flames. Stories of the Pine Woods Beast, they call it, a creature as old as the forest itself, as big as a man, but faster and far more dangerous. I always thought it was just one of those tales to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. But now, I know better. It all started last winter when my friends and I decided to go camping near the town of Pine Hollow in upstate New York. Pine Hollow is one of those places where history feels alive, even in the dead of winter. The The locals don't talk much about the past, but the stories are there if you dig deep enough. Tales of hunters who went missing, their bodies never found. Of strange howls echoing through the trees at night. Of claw marks left on cabin doors. We didn't think much of it at the time. It was just folklore, right? We were city kids looking for a weekend escape, a chance to unplug, hike, and enjoy the snowy wilderness. There were 4 of us, me, my girlfriend Sarah, and our friends Mark and Jenna. We packed up our gear and drove out early on a Friday morning. The plan was simple: hike into the woods, set up camp, and spend a couple of days away from the grind. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp, the snow crunched underfoot, and the woods were stunningly beautiful. We found a clearing near a frozen creek and set up our tents. That night, we built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and laughed about how Mark kept slipping on the ice. Everything felt normal. Until it didn't. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. I was half asleep in my tent when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. At first, I thought it was a bear, but then I remembered. Bears hibernate in the winter. I nudged Sarah awake, and we both listened. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a series of sharp, snapping noises, like something big was moving through the trees. Mark unzipped his tent and stuck his head out. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. None of us had an answer. The next morning, we found tracks around our campsite. Huge tracks. They looked canine, but they were far too large to belong to any wolf or dog. Mark joked that it must be the Pine Woods beast, but the rest of us didn't laugh. There was something unsettling about those tracks, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We tried to shake it off and went about our day, hiking deeper into the woods. But the feeling of being watched never left. Every so often, we'd hear faint noises, a branch snapping, the crunch of snow. At one point, Jenna swore she saw something move between the trees, but when we looked, there was nothing there. By the time the sun began to set, we were all on edge. We decided to head back to camp, but the woods seemed different now. The shadows were longer, the air colder. It felt like the forest itself was closing in on us. That night, everything fell apart. It started with the howling. Not the kind of howling you'd hear from a wolf pack. This was deeper, more guttural, and it didn't sound like it came from one creature. It was as if the entire forest was alive with that horrible, bone-chilling sound. We huddled around the fire, clutching whatever makeshift weapons we could find: a hatchet, a heavy flashlight, a tent pole. Then came the movement. The creature burst into the clearing like a shadow come to life. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with matted fur and eyes that seemed to glow in the firelight. Its snout was long and filled with razor-sharp teeth, and its claws looked like they could tear through steel. It let out a roar so loud I thought my ears would burst. Mark swung the hatchet, but the creature was too fast. It swiped at him, knocking him to the ground like a rag doll. Sarah screamed, and Jenna grabbed me, pulling me toward the trees. "We have to run," she shouted. We ran, stumbling through the snow, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. Behind us, the creature gave chase, its guttural growls echoing through the forest. It didn't just move, it leapt, covering ground with horrifying speed. At one point, it grabbed Jenna's scarf, yanking her back. I turned and swung the flashlight as hard as I could, hitting the creature square in the face. It let go of Jenna, but its roar told me I'd only made it angrier. We eventually made it to an old abandoned cabin we'd passed earlier in the day. We barricaded the door with whatever we could find and huddled in the corner, praying it wouldn't find us. But the creature didn't need to break in to terrify us. It circled the cabin, clawing at the walls and letting out those awful howls. At one point, it slammed against the door so hard I thought it would splinter. Then, as suddenly as it started, the attack stopped. The silence was almost worse. None of us slept that night, and when dawn finally came, we made our way back to the car as quickly as possible. Mark was injured, Jenna was in shock, and none of us could explain what we'd seen, but the tracks outside the cabin told the story well enough. Later, I learned that the Pine Woods Beast wasn't just a campfire tale. There were stories dating back to the 1800s, of hunters who went missing, of bodies found with claw marks, of strange howls in the night. Some locals even believed the creature was a shapeshifter, cursed to roam the woods forever. Others whispered about government cover-ups, about how they knew but didn't want anyone else to. None of us ever talked about what happened. Not to each other, not to anyone. We all moved away, far from Pine Hollow and its cursed woods, but I still have nightmares. Sometimes I wake up to the sound of howling, and I'm right back in that cabin, clutching a flashlight, praying for daylight. Do you know anything about this area or what this creature might be? Have you heard similar stories about the Pine Woods Beast or other creatures lurking in upstate New York? If so, I'd love to hear your experiences. Maybe together we can uncover the truth about what really stalks these woods. Here is another story from a listener, this time from a place close by in New York State. Before we dive in, please like and subscribe to this video. Your support is what keeps this channel going. Deep in the forests of upstate New York, where the Adirondack Mountains loom large and shadowy, the land holds stories. Stories of ancient spirits, beasts that prowl the wilderness, and those who venture too far and never return. These woods are vast, silent, and indifferent, but if you listen closely, you might hear whispers of a darker truth. What follows is one man's encounter, a harrowing tale of survival and terror in a place where legends refuse to die. In the fall of 1997, I was an amateur wildlife photographer and survivalist, chasing my dream of capturing nature's beauty. It was a passion born of countless weekends spent camping and trekking through forests, armed with a camera and just enough gear to get by. I'd planned a solo trip to the Adirondack wilderness, a sprawling expanse of rugged terrain and ancient trees. The idea was to spend a week photographing wildlife, documenting the fall foliage, and testing my survival skills. I had no idea I'd barely make it out alive. The first few days were uneventful, even serene. The weather was cool but manageable, and the golden hues of autumn painted the forest in breathtaking shades. I hiked deep into the wilderness, far from any marked trails, and set up camp near a small, glistening lake. The nights were colder than I anticipated, but I had my gear and felt confident in my abilities. By the third night, things started to change. It began with a sound, low, guttural, and distant, like the growl of a massive animal. At first, I dismissed it as a bear, or perhaps a moose. The Adirondacks are home to plenty of wildlife, after all. But as the night went on, the sound grew closer, circling my camp. Whatever it was, it moved with purpose, its steps heavy and deliberate. I gripped my flashlight and knife, scanning the dark forest, but saw nothing. The next morning I found tracks near my camp. Massive paw prints, larger than any wolf or dog I'd ever seen. They were pressed deep into the damp soil, and the stride was far too long for a normal animal. A chill ran down my spine as I recalled the stories I'd heard about this region. The local folklore spoke of an ancient creature, a guardian spirit turned vengeful predator. The Mohawk and Iroquois tribes told tales of the Onata-Rake, the shadow wolf. According to legend, the shadow wolf was once a protector of the forest, but it became corrupted by human greed and bloodshed. It now stalks those who wander too far, punishing trespassers with its unrelenting hunger. I tried to shake off my unease and focus on my photography. But as I moved through the forest, the feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, suffocating silence. That night, the nightmare truly began. I was lying in my tent, trying to sleep, when the growling returned. This time, it was right outside. My heart pounded as I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing and claws scraping against the fabric of my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and flung it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a massive, shadowy figure just outside the tent, its glowing yellow eyes locked onto mine. It was enormous, its black fur matted and tangled. Its snout was long, lined with jagged teeth that seemed too large for its mouth. It snarled, and I could see its breath misting in the cold night air. Without thinking, I scrambled out of the tent and bolted into the woods, leaving most of my supplies behind. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a small clearing. The creature didn't chase me, not immediately. Instead, it howled, a bone-chilling sound that echoed through the forest and seemed to vibrate in my chest. I knew it was toying with me, like a predator playing with its prey. The following days were a blur of fear and exhaustion. I was hopelessly lost, my compass spinning uselessly. Each night, the creature returned, stalking me, forcing me to move deeper into the wilderness. My food supply dwindled, and the freezing temperatures sapped my strength. At one point, I found a narrow crevice beneath a cluster of massive boulders. It was tight, but I managed to wedge myself in, hoping the creature couldn't reach me. I could hear it pacing around the area, its heavy breathing and growls filling the cold night air. Every now and then, it would let out a guttural snarl, and once I heard it clawing at the rocks above me, dislodging small stones that tumbled into my hiding spot. I held my breath, clutching my sidearm in one hand and my knife in the other, praying the thing wouldn't find a way in. By the fifth night, I was certain I wouldn't survive. My flashlight was dead, and my only weapon was a dull hunting knife. The creature's glowing eyes haunted me, appearing in the shadows wherever I turned. I was too cold to sleep, too terrified to think. I started to hallucinate, hearing whispers in the wind, ancient voices warning me to leave. But I couldn't. I was trapped. On the seventh day, I stumbled upon a small, dilapidated cabin. It was almost hidden by the overgrowth, with a sagging roof and walls covered in moss. The windows were shattered, and the door hung ajar on rusted hinges. The air around it carried a strange, foul odor, like rotting meat mixed with damp earth. I peered inside and immediately regretted it. The cabin was filled with old rusted tools and broken furniture, but what stood out were the strange carvings etched into the walls, symbols I didn't recognize but instinctively felt were wrong. On the floor, I found animal bones, some charred as if from a fire, and a tattered sleeping bag that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Someone had been there, but whoever it was, they weren't coming back. I couldn't bring myself to stay inside. The cabin felt more like a trap than a refuge, so I moved on. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades, but it was shelter. I barricaded the door with broken furniture and huddled in the corner, clutching my knife. That night, the creature attacked. It slammed against the walls, its claws raking the wood, its howls deafening. I thought the cabin would collapse, but somehow it held. When dawn finally came, the creature was gone. My body was numb, and my mind was clouded with exhaustion, but I knew I couldn't stop. I followed the faint rays of the rising sun, using the last of my strength to push forward. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, and every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch, expecting the creature to reappear. Eventually, I stumbled onto a narrow trail. It was overgrown, but it was something. I followed it for hours, my knife dull and my sidearm nearly empty, until I saw a clearing ahead. The sight of the ranger station nearly brought me to my knees. I emerged from the cabin, trembling and weak, and followed the rising sun until I found a ranger station. The rangers didn't believe me at first, but when they saw my condition and heard my story, their expressions darkened. "You're not the first," one of them admitted. "We've had reports of something, big tracks, strange howls, but no one's ever gotten a clear look at it, and no one's ever stayed out there as long as you did." Another ranger shared an old police report from the 1950s. A group of hunters had gone missing in the same area. When their camp was found, it was torn to shreds, and massive tracks led away into the forest. "They called it a bear attack," the ranger said, "but we know better." I left the Adirondacks that day and never looked back. To this day, I can't sleep without a light on. I still hear the howls in my dreams, and sometimes I swear I see those glowing eyes in the darkness. So, what is it that haunts the Adirondacks? A spirit of vengeance? A creature from another time? Or something even darker, lurking in the shadows of our understanding? If you've heard stories about the shadow wolf, or if you've seen something similar, I'd love to know. Maybe together we can uncover the truth. But I'm not going back to find out. My dear watchers, your presence is a gift. Thank you for your time, your curiosity, your courage. But remember, there are others who wander, unaware of the dangers that await. By liking this video and subscribing, you offer them a light in the darkness. Support our channel and keep the stories coming, simply by giving a thumbs up and subscribing and sharing.